Let's create a complete Flutter app using the OpenWeather API, which will display a weather for a particular city based on our request. We'll build a simple weather app that fetches and displays weather data for a specific location, in this particular case, a city. Let's go through the steps. First, make sure that you have an account with OpenWeather app. It's free, everything is free here. Even the using the API doesn't take much. I mean, it's free for so many number of requests, so you can just use it for this particular example. Next, the API that I'm going to use, we can go to the API here and then current weather data. Go to the API documentation. Inside this, you'll see on the right side weather built-in API request by city name. This is the API call. I'm going to open it in a new, give the city name of Atlanta, and I'll give the ID based on my ID here, pass it, and here is my data about Atlanta weather. Now, one thing that I want to see here is like the temperature is 302, so I'm gonna say, and it has, let's go to the API and see the units is what I want to use. In this case is imperial because I want it in Fahrenheit. So let's look at it, 84.33 Fahrenheit. That's perfect. So that's the temperature. So this is where you get the coordinates of the location. You get the weather with description. There's also icon. We get the main, which has temperature, humidity, a bunch of different things, wind speed, visibility. We have if there's clouds. There is a bunch of different things that we'll look at. But first, let's go ahead and create a project. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my desktop. See, what do I have here? I have projects and video projects. I'm going to create a new project right here on my desktop. The way to create it is Flutter, create, call it weather app. Then it's going to go ahead and create my Flutter app for me. It's going to say do this to open that Flutter app. I'm going to do that. And then it says run the Flutter app. Now, in our previous videos, we have created emulators. So I have an Android emulator already running here. I have a simulator, iOS 15 simulator already running here. I also have connected my device to this particular computer. So what we'll see is we'll also see a device of my phone connected here. So I'm going to run the Flutter app by calling Flutter run. Now this will give me options of where you want to run this particular project. I'm going to go ahead and say I want to run it on my emulator. If I press 1, it's going to go ahead and launch it. And there you go. So it launched on my Android emulator. Looks fine, works fine. This is the basic demo code that automatically comes with it. I'm going to detach it from there and I'm going to run it again. So I can also run it on my iPhone 15 emulator. I don't need the device right now. I am going to use this for if we have to use it for anything else. I'm going to use the device for that. And then number 3 is for running it in iOS simulator. If you see, the option 2 is Vivian's iPhone, so I can do that too. I can run it over there by pressing number 2. But I pressed 3 because I just want to do it in the emulator right now. And there you go, it launches on my iPhone emulator. Simulator works fine, perfectly on both the devices. So this is how you can make Flutter app. Now I don't need whatever is in this particular code. What I'm going to do is I'm going to detach it from here too. I mean, I'll let them run, but I'm gonna kill them later and then add my weather app to that. So now let me just open this. Folder. So this is my weather app. I'm going to open this in Visual Studio. Yes, I trust the authors. Now this is my project. Inside my pubspec.yaml file, first thing that I want to do is I want to add some dependencies because we are going to make a request to the URL. Also, we'll be using a bunch of state dependencies, so I need the provider dependency. So for that, I'm going to go here and I'll say that I want HTTP dependency and I want provider dependency. Now the HTTP dependency at the time of recording is 1.2.1 and I think the provider is 6.1.2. So these are the two dependencies that I would need. I'm going to say if there's a newer version available, use that, like this. So I have these added. Now once I add this, I have to make sure that these are installed in my project. So I'm going to go here and I am going to say Flutter pub get. So this will download my dependencies. It will show here, and it downloaded everything. It said that there are some newer versions available. I don't care about that. Clear on that. So next step is now creating a weather service. Now I don't want to run the code in one single file. I want to make it more organized or modular. So I'm going to create a services folder. So all the code, as you've seen before, is in library. So this is the entire code for the application. But I'm going to go here in library. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'll call that folder services, which will have my services, which is HTTP services. I'm going to create a new file. For this file, I'm going to call it weather underscore service dot file. Inside this, first I'm going to go import my Dart convert. Next, I am going to import package, HTTP package that we added, HTTP slash HTTP dot. I have not added any helpers, that's why I have to write all the code by hand. But if you've done this as many times as I've done, it's much more easier. As in, when you practice more, you'll probably get used to it. Now I'm going to create that weather service, and inside this weather service, I'm going to create a string for my API key, and I'll call it this API key. Will not I'll delete this API key after I use this. That's what I do usually. So you will not be able to use the same API key. So you'll have to make sure that you create your own. Here is the API key. Take that, put it here. Next, I need the URL. I'm going to say final string. I'll call it base URL. And I'm just going to use part of that URL in this particular case. So I am going to take only until I'll say until weather, because this city and everything will be coming from users text field. So I have that. I have my weather API available. Next, I'm going to write a function to fetch weather, but I'm going to make it a future because it's an async method. So I'm going to say future, and then the data that I get is a map of string with dynamic. The reason I'm using dynamic is because if you saw here in the API, sometimes it's key value pairs, sometimes it's arrays, sometimes it's objects. So I'm just going to say dynamic in this. That's fine. I'm going to say fetch weather. That's my function, and this function takes a parameter called as city because that's what is missing. And since it's a future, I'm going to say it's a asynchronous function. I'm going to say response, create a final for response, and I'll put an await. This is the, since this is my HTTP get request call, and this needs a URL in the format of in the class called as URI, which is a static class parse, and inside parse I will give the base URL. So let's make sure this is closed. Dollar base URL, that's what we have initialized, and then I can just go ahead here, copy this entire thing, put it here. Now for the city, we need to take that from the city object. So I'm going to just remove this, and I'll say this will take dollar city. We don't need the API key because that we have added to a variable up there, API key, and units equal to metrics. I can leave that. Units equal to imperial, can leave it that way because it will we don't have to change that ever. Next, now I'm going to say if this response dot status code, okay, it doesn't even help me a little bit, code equal to 200, which means everything went fine. The return came back, there was no problem, the server returned back a 200 response. That means I have some data, and I'm going to call this function called as JSON decode. What this does is it will take the response that I got and convert it into a and kind of convert it into an object that we can understand. Because right now it will come back as this string, and I want to convert that in, say that it's a JSON object. Let's decode that. Else, I'm going to throw an exception. In this case, I'm going to say exception, and this exception I'll say failed to load weather data. So that's kind of takes care of our service. We are trying to make a request, it will get the response. If it doesn't get, it will give me an error. So that's the first step. Next step, let's create the model. So inside this library itself, I'm going to create a new folder, call it models. This is where all my models will be, and I'm going to create a new file. I'll call this one weather dot dart. So this is my weather data data model object that kind of resembles the JSON data that we get. So, or what we are interested in. We're just going to pick that. So I'm going to say class weather. I need a final string city for the city name, depending on which city it is. I need a final string for the description. I want to know if it's cloudy, it's warm, sunny, what it is. And for the temperature, I'll create a double because that value comes as double temperature. So these are three items that I'm interested in right now. And I'm going to say weather. This is my constructor. Say required this dot city. So I'm saying this is required, not an optional. If it was optional, you've probably seen in my previous videos on Dart how do you do optional. Next is by using the question mark. This dot description, that is also required. And another thing that is required is this dot temperature. So this will put everything together that I need with using this constructor. Next, I'm going to call a factory weather dot from. In this from I get the JSON data. So from JSON, and that is of the type as we've seen before in the previous provider service. In the service class, it is of the type this, and then that, okay, that is, let's say, the JSON. That's what I'm passing. And what do I do with that? With that, I am going to say return weather city equal to JSON. And where is my city? Let's see. In this particular case, if you see, this is the city at the bottom. So I'm going to give that a JSON name. Next, I need is description, and description comes from JSON. Oh, I forgot this has to be in quotes. And JSON, inside this, where is my description? Description is right here on the top, broken clouds. So it's in the weather. So I'm going to say weather, and it's an array of items. So I'm going to say weather of 0, and inside that I have description. So that takes care of description. Next thing that we need is the temperature. So now that you know, I'm going to go a little faster. JSON, it's inside main, and inside that, see, it's an object, so I am interested in temperature. So I'm going to say that's temperature. So that will get me the 3 items. You can take more items if you want. If you want to do more on this particular project, you can add more things to it. So I'm going to close that semicolon. Next thing, now we'll create the weather provider. So to create the weather provider, I usually create a folder here called as providers, and I add all the providers in there. Create a new file. This one I'm going to call it weather underscore provider dot dart. Now inside this file, I'll need a bunch of packages. So first, I need my package flutter slash material dot dart. So this is the first project I'm doing in this particular computer, so that's why everything going forward, I'll install all the required plugins for IntelliSense, so I don't have to type everything by manually. Dot dot slash, I need models from weather dot dart. This kind of puts everything together. I also need dot dot services, and that services is weather service dot dart. So I have all these three imported. Next, let's create this weather provider, and this will be using change notifier. If there's changes in this, it will execute some functions. Weather, which is not required in this particular case, I'm going to say of weather. I also need boolean, which is loading, and this is what I'm creating, that if something is loading, initially I set it to false, and then when I'm fetching data I'll set that to true. Next thing that I want is weather service. Weather service will be weather service, and this I will initialize by calling the weather service function. So that takes care of that. Now that I have all these things, three variables defined, first thing that I want to do is get the weather. So I'm going to say weather get weather. I'm writing the getter for that, underscore weather. Next thing I want to do is write a getter for the is loading, and that is underscore is loading. See, both of these guys are right here, so I'm going to do that. For this I have already initialized it, so you don't have to do anything, but this is I'm going to write the getters for this. Next, let's write a fetch weather function here, which is future, and void is the type. Let's say fetch weather, it takes string city async. This is not the same as fetch weather that we did earlier where we are calling an API. This is different. And here I am going to say is loading is equal to true, because now someone has initialized this method for downloading the weather. Notify, so since it started, I'm going to notify the listeners of whoever is listening to this, listeners, and then I'll try calling the weather service and fetching the data. So for that I'll say data equal to await underscore weather service that we created, and that has the method fetch weather, and I pass the city to it. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the weather object from weather dot from JSON that we wrote in the model and pass it the data. So it will take that data, go to this model, and this one will convert it into a model object or an object of the type weather, which will be assigned to this. If now there are errors, there's always errors, some or other errors. I might not get errors because I have done this so many times, but if you are doing it first time, you might get errors. So if and when you get those errors, if you get stuck, you can check online, or you can always add them in the comments downstairs below here. Is loading, so finally is loading equal to false. So after everything is done, for example in this case, let's say it fetches the weather, or if it gets error, but still my loading is set to true, that I'm going to set to false because everything is done. And then I'm going to call the notify listeners saying that I am done here. So that's my weather provider class. So that's good. Now next, let's create the UI. So I'm going to go back to main dart. So we created the models, we created the provider, we created the services. Now let's go to here. I want to delete everything, but I'm going to keep as much as possible. Like for example, this package I'll keep. I'll add the provider package that we've added. So that is for creating widgets. I am going to call it, I think it's provider.dart. Next thing that I need is the things that we have built, which is dot slash providers or provider, yeah, the folder that I've created, not the package. And inside that we created weather underscore provider dot dart. Next I need the screens. I'm going to create screens for this separately, not in the same UI. It's always a bad practice to put all your UI in the main dart. It's better to spread it out into screens. So I create something called as screens or views, whatever you want to call it, whatever you're comfortable with. Weather screen dot dart. So these are the things that I'm going to create. So that means I need, okay, let's create new folder screens, and inside this screens folder create a new file called as weather screen dot, which I'll write later based on the function that we create here. So let's go back to main. Now here, void main run app my app, so that's good. Next is my app extends. You can change the name of the application if you want, but I'll keep it as it is. Stateless widget override widget build. So this is all good. The first thing that you want to change here is right here. I don't want to return this thing. So whether app build context, and I don't have this one because I deleted the home page. So I am gonna get rid of all. I hate it when this happens, when my mouse double clicks. Okay, get rid of this, get rid of this. There's no counter code, all these things I can just delete it. Okay, so this is all that we have now. We don't have a screen, so let's create the screen. But first, return change notifier provider. So the reason I am using this is, oh, I think I might have misspelled something somewhere. That's why it is change notifier. Oops, see, change notifier provider, and this provider. Let's see in our provider class. Nope, there's nothing. So I don't know. Let's see when it gives error. We'll know if we did something wrong. So change notifier provider. I'm calling this class. Inside this, return this, and then inside this, I want to create a context which is the weather provider. So I'm going to say context, which is so weather provider that will run the show. That's what I'm saying here. Initialize that. Next, I want to create what are the different children that this particular change notifier provider has. So it has the material app, and this material app has a title which we'll call it weather app. It will have a theme. What theme does it follow? I am gonna say I'm gonna use from theme data, which is a class that exists where you can select what theme you want. I can say primary swatch for this particular app. You can look at all the material designs that we have in Flutter and see which one do you want to pick. Colors dot blue, that's the pattern that I want to go with. Next, after theme, so we'll say home is weather screen. So this will point it to the home page. The home page for this particular view is this weather screen, which will be writing soon. Make sure everything is proper. Okay, looks good to me. Next, let's go jump into the weather screen where we'll actually write the weather screen data in here. So it's going to give me an error now if I run it because there's no weather screen available. So I'm going to main first. I'll copy this. This is what I need here. I also need the provider package inside the screen because of the widgets that I'm using here. I need the providers weather provider. Since it's inside a folder, it'll be double dot slash providers to access that. So now let's create the weather screen. Weather screen extends the stateful widget because I want to keep the state here, and inside this I will override a function override the create state weather screen state. That's how you create the call the create state, and this will using the arrow function I'll say uses weather screen state. Okay, that will take care of that weather screen state. Next, I'm going to create the weather screen state, which actually takes care of the statefulness. Weather screen state. Now this class extends from state where oops, sorry, and inside state it is the object of weather screen, and this will be our implementation for that. So first, let's create the city controller. So I'm going to call it, as the name goes, city controller. Now this city controller will be a text editing controller, because we'll have a text field for it. Next, let's override some widget classes. So widget functions build, where we have to pass the build context, and that is the context name. And inside here, I'm going to say final weather provider. Some people like to use underscores in between. I like to use camel casing, and provider dot of this, in this case, weather provider, and pass the context to it. So that will give me the weather provider. Next, I am going to return a scaffold for this, for the screen, and this scaffold will have an app bar on the top, which is of the type app bar. These are built-in tools that are available. Text, which will read out as weather app. So that's the first thing that we'll have. Okay, I don't need anything else in the app bar. Next, the body of the screen. The body will have, let's say, a padding object, so it pads the entire body properly, and it has a parameter called as padding to itself, where you specify how much padding you want. So in this particular case, I'm going to say constant edge insets, just so that it works perfectly in all the devices. Insets all is 16.0, so that's what it, from all the sides it will have a padding of 16. Next, I want to do the child inside this, which I am going to use the column object, and inside this column I'll have children, children, yep, which will be an array of items. First one, let's go for the text field. So this is where the weather data will be entered, and inside text field I am going to say controller is underscore city controller. So this is the one that controls it. Next, how does it look like? Let's use decoration for that, and inside decoration I'm going to say input decoration is what I'll use object, and inside that I'll say label text. The text that I want for that should be enter city, the name of the city where user will enter. That's what it tells him. I will use a suffix icon for it after the end of the text field. Instead of using a button, I will use the icon button, which is of the type icon, which of the type icon, and that I think is called icon dot search, if I'm not wrong. And then what happens when you press on that icon, that also I have to specify. On pressed is the function that is called over there, and when you press on that button, I want to do weather provider. Where is my weather provider, the object that we created, and I'm going to say fetch weather, and I'll have to pass the city controller dot text. So whatever user has entered, I'm going to pass that text over there to them. So let's close all these things. Let's see, this is done. 1, 2, and then 3 closes the text field, closes this, and then my array is right here. So this is how you can actually check where you want to write the next object. Now next is sized box. So below it I'll create a box which is of the height of 20. So that kind of gives a little bit of padding, and then I'll say weather provider dot. So I'm checking here, is weather provider loading right now? Nope. If it's loading, what do I want to do? I want to give a loading indicator. So I'm going to use the circular progress indicator, and this will just show the progress indicator that something is happening. If it's not loading, if it's already has the data that we need, let's make sure that this is spaced properly. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say weather provider dot weather equal to null is equal to null. If this is null, then what do I want to do in this? So again, I'm like kind of putting one more condition here. If it's equal to null, I'm going to say no data available or no data. If it has a date, if it has some data inside it, I'm going to create a column object, and inside that, again, I mean, it's becoming too complicated, children, but that's how in Flutter you kind of create objects inside children. And text, the text that I want inside that is weather provider dot weather dot city. So I want to display the name of the city. Now I want to style it to make it a little bit bigger. So I am going to use the style property and say text style. So there's a function called as text style or class costing, which says font size is 24. So you give the font size, you can give font weight. Now I want it a little bit bolder, so I am going to say font weight dot bold. I think that's the parameter for that. Hopefully that's it, but we'll probably see if it doesn't look anything like what we imagine. Next another text which is for the description. So I'm going to use the same code pretty much and say weather dot this. Oh, also one more thing that you have to remember is that I am making them required so that data will be available. So I'm going to unwrap them here using that description, using the bang operator. That's what's called description. Style is text style, font of, let me make it a little bit smaller and remove the rest of the stuff. I don't want this to be bold, comma, make sure that all my formatting is standard. Next, I need, what else should I add? What was the third one? I think it was the temperature. Yep, main thing. So for this, I am going to put it in a proper format. I'm going to say dollar. Inside this, I'm going to say weather provider dot weather dot temperature, and then here say Fahrenheit. So that's why I put it in quotes. Now for this I am going to, let's copy this, paste it here. Let's make it a little bit bigger than before because this is the main temperature that we want. So that's good. Closing this. Let's look at, okay, it's good that it's closing the array, closing this, close the array again, and then close this. This is good. This one, and then finally I think this is the end. Okay, perfect. So that's my entire stuff. So now next let's dispose of. So there's also a dispose function which is always a good practice to write. Override void dispose. This will dispose of all the elements when it's done, so it doesn't cause any problem. So I'm going to say dispose of the city controller, and then I'll also call super dot dispose. Perfect. So that will take care of our application. So this should probably have everything that we need. Let's run it and see how it looks like. So I'm in the right folder and I am going to say flutter run. It's going to give me the options where I want to run. I'll say 1 in the Android emulator. Okay, here is the change notifier. So we got that error. So let's go ahead and make sure that, where is that? Yep, here. Spelling mistake. Change notifier. Let's go back. Let's see if it works. This is what happens if you don't have the IntelliSense, and it will not give you outputs. From the next project onwards, I'm going to make sure that that is installed so we don't have to go through this. It says it's built successfully. Let's go ahead and look at the emulator, and as you can see, it's adding. Let's add the city Atlanta and search, and there we go. We have the data. I'm going to add another city, Washington DC, search. You're going to give me Washington DC temperature. If I say Miami, it's 87.76. Perfect. So this is how you can do this particular thing. Now next, I'm going to go and do the same thing for iOS and see if it works on iOS emulator. So we have the iOS emulator running from before. I am going to say pick 3, gonna compile, build, and then run it over here. Let's do the same thing, Atlanta, search, and Atlanta, search. So you also saw a case where if there's no data, it will show that. Miami, search, and we have our app completed. So if you have any problems, any other issues than what we faced here, let me know in the comments and I'll help you solve those. And this kind of covers our weather app. Let's do a more complex one in the next one, and I'll make sure that all the IntelliSense is installed.